Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I have an absolutely fascinating story for you, a story that Keith Morrison of Dateline calls the most sensational and fascinating story of his career. This is considered one of the biggest and most sensational true crime stories in British Columbia. And today, decades after the initial event, there are as many questions as there are answers. A plane crash, a death, a disappearance, and a shocking discovery all make up today's story, At the Bottom of the Lake. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in Penticton, British Columbia, a beautiful little village in the Okanagan Valley. Two young people, teenagers, who had fallen in love in high school have decided to elope. They were Yurgoslan Ambrozuk, who went by Jerry. He was a 19-year-old immigrant from Poland living in Canada, and the other person is 18-year-old Dianne Babcock, his girlfriend. Jerry had been training to become a pilot and had already taken a year of flight school. You can see here in his yearbook photo, the caption says, "Flying is this guy's major interest outside of school as he plans to become a senior airlines commercial pilot." Dianne was a very good student, a pretty girl with lots of friends who ran track and wanted to become a nurse. Now, Jerry and Dianne's families did not approve of their relationship. So this was, as we so often see in these types of cases, a Romeo and Juliet situation where two young lovers are being kept apart by their families. Dianne's father would later say this was not true, but many believe it was. So Jerry and Dianne had decided to disappear together. They saved up around $2,200, which is around $7,000 in today's economy. They packed their clothing and other items that they needed, but they weren't just going to get on a bus and leave. Jerry had other plans. Jerry and Dianne had watched two movies that inspired their plan. The first movie is Tarzan the Ape Man, and the second is Apocalypse Now. Jerry and Dianne decided that they were going to disappear and live off the land in the jungle, just as the characters in those movies had. Their plan was to end up in South America, but first, they had to get out of Canada. And that's when Jerry told Dianne what he wanted to do. But before they could put their plan into action, Dianne found out she was pregnant. She went to a clinic and terminated the pregnancy, keeping this all a secret from their parents. It was then time to put Jerry's plan into action. He would rent a small plane from the Vancouver airport and fly over the Canadian border. Jerry and Dianne arrived at the airport and rented this Cessna 150, and then began their journey east to Penticton. They had no plans of ever landing the plane. As unbelievable as it sounds, Jerry planned to ditch the plane in a lake so he and Dianne could then vanish. The trip to Penticton, east, was to throw people off and make them believe they were headed in a different direction. Jerry and Dianne landed in Penticton and spent the afternoon wandering in the area so their presence would be noted. They then climbed back into the Cessna 150 and headed north to once again throw off anyone tracking the plane. Jerry then made a sharp turn southeast and headed towards Montana. Before they left Penticton, Jerry and Dianne changed into swim clothes and put everything else they owned, including the money, into two duffel bags. They were preparing to swim. Now, this plane was a fixed-wheel aircraft. It was not made for a water landing. Jerry knew this, but he was convinced he could land the aircraft safely on the water. This was, of course, a very bad plan. 3 hours after taking off in Penticton, the plane was on fumes and it was getting dark. Luckily, the couple was right where they wanted to be, flying over Bitterroot Lake in Montana. Jerry began to descend, preparing for a controlled crash on the water. He slowed to stall speed and took off his seatbelt, convinced that he could hang on to the steering wheel when the plane hit the water. He was very, very wrong. Dianne did not remove her seatbelt or her shoulder harness. Jerry brought the plane down just feet over the water, but the second the wheels hit the still water, it was like the plane hit a concrete wall. Jerry was thrown from the plane through a broken windshield. He was in the cold, dark water, and he could taste blood in his mouth. He couldn't see anything as night had fallen. Jerry swam to the surface and started yelling for Dianne. He said, "Dianne, are you there?" And she yelled back, "I'm here. I just can't get my seatbelt off." Jerry did not know it at the time, but the plane had flipped onto its top when the plane hit the water, and he was thrown behind the plane, not in front of it. So when Jerry swam around the plane, he thought he was on the passenger side, but he was actually at the driver's side door, and he could not get it open. Dianne was on the opposite side of the plane, hanging upside down by her seatbelt. Water was rushing into the cabin of the plane very quickly, and Jerry was beginning to struggle in the freezing cold water. He pulled at the door of the plane over and over, but he claims within seconds the plane was underwater. Jerry saw one of the duffel bags floating in the water. He saw the shoreline in the distance, and he decided to save himself. He grabbed the duffel bag and swam for shore, leaving Dianne to drown, trapped in the plane. Jerry's last glimpse of Dianne was her trapped in the seatbelt, upside down, screaming underwater. Jerry headed for the shore, hoping that Dianne would surface after freeing herself. He crawled onto the shore of the lake and claims that he waited. The next morning, a woman and her mother pulled up to their cabin and saw a strange man standing on the deck. The man was wearing a white polo. He was dry and clean. And the woman and her mother told the young man, "You're trespassing. Why are you here?" The young man wouldn't give them his name or tell them what he was doing there. They asked, "Where did you come from?" The young man pointed and said, "Over those mountains." The mother gave the young man kind of a talking to. He quickly left the property and wandered down the shore of the lake. The two women at the cabin did not know that two locals, twin brothers named Jim and John, had already encountered this young man a few hours earlier. But when they saw the young man, Jerry, he was soaking wet and appeared to be injured. They said the young man was scratched up and bleeding, and he told Jim and John that a bear had chased him. As Jim and John talked with this young man, who we know is Jerry, he told them that his lighter was wet and he really, really needed his lighter. So Jim and John, being the kind strangers they are, went to the store to buy Jerry either matches or a lighter. As the two men drove to the store, they noticed that the lake looked strange. There was an oily sheen on the water. Across the lake, a pilot radioed the sheriff to let him know that there was oil in the water and it did not look like boat oil. Now, there had been some rumors of smuggling taking place in the area, and the locals began to wonder if a smuggler's plane had gone down in the water. But as rumors of the young stranger began to spread, they put the pieces together. John and Jim returned from the store and gave Jerry the matches he bought. Jerry built a fire and did something very strange. He began burning maps and articles of clothing he took from the duffel bag. After that, the two men watched as the young man simply walked away. A sheriff's deputy was sent to investigate the rumors of a crashed plane in the area. The sheriff found the site where this mysterious young man had built the fire using the matches the twins had purchased for him. And in the ashes of that fire, the sheriff's deputy, who was a pilot himself, found something called a gust lock, which is an aircraft part that locks control surfaces and keeps open the aircraft doors when the plane is parked. The deputy took the gust lock to the airport and matched it to a Cessna 150. He then informed his boss, who contacted investigators and told them he needed a search team for the lake. They were looking for a downed plane. Divers were sent into the lake and word spread like wildfire. Locals and media personnel gathered at the lake day after day to watch the divers. More than a week of searching passed, and people began to wonder if there really was a plane in the lake. On the fifth day of the search, the sheriff was informed of a new technology back then, side scanning radar. So he located one of those devices and it was lowered to the bottom of the lake. Just as the search was about to be called off, the sonar began to signal. A camera was sent down and the divers stood on a boat on the surface of the lake and viewed the images. There was a plane at the bottom of the lake, 250 feet down. That's too deep for divers. So they used the camera to guide hooks down to the plane, and it was dragged from the bottom of the lake to about 150 feet deep, where divers could reach. The divers went down to the plane, and they were horrified to see that there was the body of a woman inside the cabin. Her seatbelt was still on. The divers got underneath the wings of the plane and kind of swam it towards the surface, lifting the plane as they went. As the plane came out of the water, all of the bystanders fell silent. The woman's long hair was stuck in the plane door, hanging out of the side of the aircraft. It was, of course, a very shocking scene. The body was removed and taken to the state pathologist in Missoula, Montana. The woman's body was in very good condition because of the cold water. She actually looked like she was sleeping. It was a tragedy, but it was also now a mystery. Who was this young woman, and how did she end up in a crashed plane in a small Montana lake? Inside the plane, investigators found a life raft, clothing that appeared to be disguises. They found survival gear, a duffel bag that contained sleeping bags, and extra clothing, and it became apparent to them that the people inside this plane were planning to dump the plane and get into the life raft, disguise themselves, and then probably disappear. Now, let's go back a few days. At the same time the oil was seen on the lake, and before the investigation and search for the plane began, a man named Ron Peterson, who was a constable at the Vancouver airport, began seeing some unusual activity at the airport. Search and rescue officials had arrived at the airport, and then Ron found out they were looking for a missing plane. So Ron began to ask around and found out that a Cessna 150 had been taken from the airport and was then seen in a no-fly zone buzzing the surrounding mountains. In fact, a complaint had been registered about the plane because it was flying in a no-fly zone. Problem was, no one knew what happened to that plane. A woman named Margot Harper, who was a young reporter at the Vancouver Sun, heard about the missing plane, and she began to investigate the story. She was able to get the names of the two people who had rented the plane that vanished: Jerry Ambrozuk and Dianne Babcock. Margot found out that Jerry and Dianne were a couple, and then she found out that their families were trying to keep them apart. She contacted Dianne's family, who was, as she puts it, out of their minds with worry, wondering where their daughter was. Search and rescue personnel were scouring the mountains near Vancouver, convinced they were going to find a downed plane with two teenagers inside. Margot continued to look into the missing plane, and then a week later, police in Vancouver got a phone call informing them that a close friend of Jerry's had received a call from New York City. Tom Pulowski told the police that his friend, Jerry Ambrozuk, called him and told him a very shocking story. Jerry told Tom that the plane he'd rented had been ditched, crashed on purpose in a lake in Montana. Jerry told Tom that Dianne was still in the plane and that Jerry had fled the scene of the crash. Where was Jerry now? At a bus terminal in New York City. Jerry told Tom that he was on the run and that he did not plan on getting caught. The RCMP called the sheriff in Montana after hearing that a plane had been found in a lake there. Constable Ron Peterson flew to Montana to investigate, and the RCMP got a warrant allowing them to put a tap on Tom Pulowski's phone, hoping that Jerry would call again, and Jerry did. Tom got a call saying it was a collect call from a man named Luis Gomez in Dallas, Texas. Luis was, of course, Jerry. The things Jerry said in that phone call were even more shocking. Jerry didn't talk about a Romeo and Juliet type love. He said he was just trying to get away from his family, and Dianne simply tagged along. Jerry said Dianne was in love with him and claimed she couldn't live without him, and he had simply allowed her along for the ride. But then later in the conversation, Jerry tells Tom, "Dianne is gone. I'm all alone. It's lonely." Jerry also told Tom that he wanted to make sure Dianne's body was found. He had no plans to come home. He knew he was going to be charged with murder and that he was going to continue to run. Tom told Jerry it's not murder if it was an accident. And Jerry tells Tom, "They're going to think I killed her and I'm not ever coming back." Tom tells Jerry, "They're going to look for you forever." And Jerry replies, "They'll never find me." He was half right. The reporter, Margot Harper, flew to Montana and was standing on the banks of the lake as the plane was pulled from the water. She said she will never forget seeing the long hair hanging from the closed door, and she knew at some point Dianne was able to get the door open only to have it slammed closed again, trapping her hair as she did. Her death had been awful. The autopsy report came back. Dianne had a broken collarbone and a fracture in her neck. The side of her face and head were severely bruised, but those were all survivable injuries. Dianne had died from drowning. The lap belt holding Dianne inside the plane had flipped over against her body, and the weight of her body made it pretty much impossible for her to reach the buckle and release it. The belt wasn't broken, the latch was working, but the way the buckle had turned over with all of that weight on it, she couldn't get to it. Now, investigators started to think, and it seemed odd to them that Dianne had not made much of an attempt to unlatch the belt. At autopsy, the sheriff asked that the coroner pay special attention to Dianne's hands to see if she had fought to release the latch on the seatbelt. Her nails were not broken. Her knuckles were not bruised. It did not seem at all like she had fought to get that seatbelt undone. You'd think that if you were struggling to get out of a seatbelt, you'd break your fingers if that's what you had to do in order to get free. Yet none of those injuries were present, and they started to think it's almost like Dianne thought somebody was helping her. When the police discovered Dianne's identity, they also learned she had had the abortion days before the plane crash, and they began to wonder, was Jerry intentionally trying to get rid of Dianne? The sheriff's deputies in Montana began to go over all of the details of the crash, and they firmly believed that Jerry had time to save Dianne's life had he wanted to. They went over all the scenarios and became convinced that Jerry intentionally left Dianne to die a horrible death that night. Cops in Montana decided to file charges against Jerry Ambrozuk. He was charged with multiple crimes, including the death of Dianne Babcock, and they knew they had to find Jerry Ambrozuk, but they had no idea just how long they would be searching for him. Officer Rick Hawk, one of the divers who pulled the plane from the water, was given the task of finding Jerry Ambrozuk. Officer Hawk knew Jerry had been in Dallas, but they knew he was probably long gone by then. Months passed, and then years. The manhunt was officially active, but there were no leads as to where Jerry had gone. Jerry never contacted his family, not once. He stopped calling his friend Tom, and 9 years went by. Jerry Ambrozuk was listed as one of America's Most Wanted in 1991. This story was featured several times on the television show throughout the 90s. Dianne Babcock's father continued to call the RCMP. At first, he called once a week and then once a month, each time hoping to hear there was good news, but he never got it. In 1999, Dianne's father and mother were driving to the cemetery to visit their daughter's grave, which is something they did often. As they drove, a bus crashed into their car and Dianne's mother was killed at only 65 years old. Oh my goodness. How much can one family endure? The 25th anniversary of the plane crash was approaching. It was now 2006. Sheriff DuPont was ready to retire without ever solving the case, and he wondered if he would ever know what happened to Jerry Ambrozuk. Across the country, a woman named Gina Johnson had gone through a divorce. Gina decided to start dating, and she signed up for some online dating apps. She worked for Texas Instruments in Dallas as a technology specialist. It was Gina's job to find very small things in the data and the technology that might fail. Her job was to look for details that seem off. Gina had been very hurt by her divorce, and so in her online dating bio, she wrote, "I hate dishonest people." Men began responding to Gina's profile, and in the spring of 2006, she came across the profile of a man she was attracted to. His profile said he was 34 years old and that he was looking to settle down, get married, and have children. Gina was 33 at the time. Gina was especially attracted to the part of the man's profile that said, "I am honest and don't cheat or play games." Gina and this man, named, curiously enough, Michael Smith, the most common name ever, made plans for a first date, and they met at a restaurant. When John arrived, he was driving a Dodge Viper. That's a car that cost $80,000 back in 2006. So Gina thought to herself, well, he obviously makes a good living. The two sat and had dinner, and Gina, being a detail-oriented person, noticed Michael's class ring. The class ring was from a college, and Michael told Gina that he had a degree in aerospace engineering. And Gina thought, that's impossible. Why? Because Michael's class ring was from the year Gina would have been graduating from high school, and Michael claimed to be just a year older than she was. There was no way he had gone to college and finished by the year the class ring had on it. Gina said, wow, you must be pretty intelligent, and Michael just smiled. Gina did not forget about this. The two continued to talk, but she noticed that Michael didn't speak much about his past. Michael told Gina that he had only been in love once to a girl he knew as a teenager, a girl who was killed in a terrible accident. Michael claimed he was heartbroken over her death. Gina and Michael's relationship went slowly at first, but then it got more serious, and Gina began to realize as they became intimate that Michael did not look 34 years old. There were little things that set red flags off in her head. Michael seemed much older than 34, and one day Michael said to Gina, "Don't you think I look good for my age?" And Gina said, "Well, if you want me to be honest, you look much older than 34. Gina said Michael wasn't too happy about that, but he finally admitted, "I'm older than I said I was." Gina was angry. She had told Michael how important honesty was to her, and so she pushed him, asking, "How old are you?" And Michael said, "I'm 43. Gina was upset. She said, "If you've lied to me about that, what else have you lied to me about?" And she said, "Is Michael Smith even your real name?" And Michael hung his head. Gina said, "You've got to be kidding me." Gina then had to make a decision. For a few weeks, she continued dating Michael, but then she insisted he be honest with her. Michael Smith finally relented and told Gina his name was Jared or Jarek Ambrozuk. She asked, "Why did you lie?" And Michael, Jerry, wouldn't tell her. The next day, Gina went to work and Googled the name Jared Ambrozuk. The very first thing that popped up, the story of Jerry Ambrozuk, the story of the plane crash and the dead girl found inside the plane at the bottom of the lake. Gina also found out that Jerry was a wanted man. She sat in horror as she read that Jerry was the person on America's Most Wanted list, listed for the longest time. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I could not survive in today's dating world. Gina didn't tell Jerry she'd found this information. She knew he was wanted for negligent homicide, but Gina was kind of intrigued. Jerry invited Gina to come with him on a business trip to Japan. She was kind of having a hard time reconciling the man she knew with the man she'd read about online. They did not seem like the same person. Gina knew this was the same person, but he was so very different. Right before the trip to Japan, Gina confronted Jerry. Jerry said, "Yes, that's me. I miss my family. I want to go back, but I can't turn myself in because I'm scared of what will happen to me." Gina told Jerry, "I can't see myself dating someone who's living a lie." They had an argument, but Gina decided she would go to Japan with Jerry. In the beginning, they had a wonderful trip. Gina took a lot of photos, but as they traveled, Jerry became annoyed with Gina for taking so many photos. And he told her he didn't feel she was warming up to him in the way he'd hoped. The two had a more serious argument. On the trip home, Jerry gave Gina his first-class ticket so she could ride in luxury back to Dallas. Does that mean he rode first class and put her in coach on the way there? Excuse me, what? I'm fine with riding coach, but Jason ain't riding in first class if I'm in coach. He'll be on the wing before that happens. When the couple arrived back in the States, Gina broke up with Michael, Jerry. She couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done, and she thought, if he's innocent, why won't he turn himself in? She wondered if she should turn him in, and she continued to search online for information. And then she read about Dianne's father, who had called the RCMP over and over for years, looking for information on his daughter. And Gina's conscience began to bother her. Sheriff DuPont was packing his office to begin his retirement. As he was spending some of his last days in office, he got a phone call. From who? Gina Johnson. Gina picked up the phone and left a voicemail stating she was quite sure she had been dating Jerry Ambrozuk and she was willing to tell people where he was. Sheriff DuPont could not believe what he was hearing. He contacted the police in Dallas, who found an old mugshot of Michael Smith. Jerry had been arrested twice for burglary decades earlier, and then they realized this was the same man, and it was time to move. A team of plainclothes officers arrived at a nice home in an upscale neighborhood in Plano, Texas. They knocked on the door of the home, and Jerry Ambrozuk answered it. One of the cops said, "Are you Michael Smith?" And Jerry said, "Yes." And the next thing he knew, the police were pointing guns at his head. They handed Jerry his arrest warrant, and he saw the name Jerry Ambrozuk at the top, and he knew he'd been caught. Jerry was arrested and taken to jail. He was placed in a padded cell deemed a suicide risk. He then made his first phone call home in 25 years. His parents told him they never lost hope that he would come home someday. They never moved, and they kept the same phone number, hoping that one day they would see their son again. It's just so cruel. People that do things like this to their families, it is so cruel. Jerry then began to tell investigators his story. From the lakeshore in Montana, Jerry took a train to New York, and then he hitchhiked to Texas. The man who picked him up when he was hitchhiking stole the $2,000 he still had and then abandoned him in Dallas. Jerry was flat broke and homeless for weeks. He then met a man who told him he knew how he could get a new identity. Jerry went to a cemetery and found the grave of a man who had recently died. He was the same age as Jerry. Jerry knew that his death records would not be on record yet because the death was so recent. The dead man's name? Michael Lee Smith. His name was actually Michael Smith. Jerry went to the county recorder's office and said he was Michael Smith. He was able to obtain Michael's birth certificate, and from there, he got a driver's license. He got his GED, and then a job with the city of Arlington. He began working in aerospace engineering. He had to go through a background check that he knew he couldn't pass if he wanted to continue with that job. And that's when he decided to get into computers. Jerry started his own company designing websites, and he was good at it. He worked hard and he was very successful. He had clients like Honda Racing, and that allowed him to travel the world. Jerry was living the good life until a woman he met online ended it all. Jerry was now sitting in jail, facing up to 10 years in Montana. He was extradited back to Montana, and the press was waiting at the airport for him. People listened in shock as they heard Jerry's story, rising to become a wealthy tech businessman in Texas. Sheriff DuPont told the press that he was surprised to see Jerry looking fit and clean cut. The sheriff said he believes that Jerry is a sociopath and that, yes, he is very intelligent, but he didn't realize he was so successful. Jerry went before a judge to face his charges, denying he was guilty. He pled not guilty, stating Dianne willingly got into the plane knowing the risks. Jerry said yes, he was guilty of landing the plane, but that he was very remorseful and felt horrible that Dianne had died. Jerry ended up pleading guilty to theft and criminal mischief, and then he pled no contest to negligent homicide. What is his punishment? A few months in jail, after which he was deported back to Canada. He was given a 10-year suspended sentence and ordered to pay $34,000 in restitution. Jerry continues to claim that the entire event was a tragic accident. He went on to write a book, and he runs a website with all of the details of the case. Like I said in the beginning, there are as many questions as there are answers on this story. Is Jerry Ambrozuk a monster who left Dianne Babcock to die in a watery grave, or is he a remorseful boyfriend who lost the love of his life on a cold night in Montana when she sank to the bottom of the lake? You will have to decide for yourself. Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I truly appreciate your support, and a special thank you to my patrons. You know, I've got 2 podcasts. This one is called Dining with Death. This one is called Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. I post brand new episodes of this one every Monday and every Wednesday. Both podcasts are on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. If you've got a few extra bucks and you want to donate to a good cause, would you watch this short little video on my channel? It will explain to you everything our community is doing to donate money to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that's never been tested. We are trying to help solve some cold crimes. As always, I appreciate you watching. I know you have so many options, and the fact that you choose my channel means the world to me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.